Hi again, welcome to clip 3 of this week's lecture on reflexivity and feminism. So in the previous clip I told you about the core idea of reflexivity, and I think I already mentioned in the first clip that the historical trajectory that led to this kind of real moment of self-questioning in anthropology, particularly in the 1980s, includes very, very strongly the development of feminist anthropology, particularly in the 1970s, and its whole trajectory ever since, of course. So for me, to understand reflexivity as a moment and as a current in anthropology, as we're trying to do this week, one also has to take into account the enormous catalytic influence that feminist thinking played in those decades and developed subsequently, of course, in ways that were kind of intertwined in all sorts of ways, as one finds so often in the development of historical things. Nothing is linear, everything is complex. I hope you're getting a sense of that throughout this course. So in this clip, I'm looking at this story very, very briefly, unfortunately, as so often happens. One could give a whole lecture to each of the kind of slides that I'm presenting to you, but that's just the nature of these kinds of courses. A very quick kind of indication, at least, of the importance of the development of feminist anthropology in this context. And I've got this distinction here between this is very, very broad, but I hope in some ways helpful, between what we might call the age of commitment in the 1970s, in the aftermath of the 1960s students' movement, civil rights in the United States, post-colonial freedom fighting and movements throughout the colonial world since the Second World War, but very much alive in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and all the way to the 80s. Think of how late apartheid ended in South Africa. I very much remember, I'm of that generation who remembers that moment of Nelson Mandela kind of walking out of prison effectively. That whole period was a period of radical politics and a period in which students also, but many other people, but students were central to this, were thinking really big thoughts about how things could change in the world, and were invited by the very circumstances in which they were living to take a stance and be committed to these causes, I should say. So that's the kind of atmosphere in which feminism, I've put here a kind of slide from women's liberation movement, was developing, and this produced an age of commitment which rippled out in the 1980s in anthropology specifically into a kind of also an age of self-doubt, interestingly. I put here Edvard Munch's famous, I think it's one of the most widely reproduced paintings of all time, I gather, so I'm being a bit kind of commercial perhaps in using this image. But anyway, this kind of scream of self-doubt and of existential angst rippled through the discipline of anthropology in the 1980s in what came to be known as the crisis of representation. A crisis that anthropologists felt on the back of these radical political influences of the 60s and 70s, in their own claims to authority, their own claims to be able to represent the people that they were studying. All this came into radical self-doubt and crisis. The iconic book is from 1986. I think a number of books actually came out that year, but there's an edited book by James Clifford and George Marcus called Writing Culture, and that was a real moment. We often talk about the writing culture generation because that book was so influential, an edited book of primarily American anthropologists, so I believe not exclusively, if I'm not mistaken, really kind of self-questioning the history of anthropology and its claims to authority, and trying to deconstruct it. I mentioned in an earlier clip, this was also the age in broader philosophy and social theory in which postmodernism became a tag word. We were beyond the certainties and claims to progress of modernity, and into an age of rudderless, in many ways, polyglottic, heteroglossic, polyvocal, multivocal conceptions of knowledge, where this kind of Enlightenment idea of an underlying certainty that could be built upon is radically deconstructed, questioned, and playfully critiqued. That's the kind of spirit of postmodernism that you see in architecture, in art, but also in social theory and in anthropology as well. So that's the 1980s as an age of self-doubt. But I'm making this link here between the age of commitment, in which feminism burst forth in anthropology and beyond, and its link to this kind of moment of reflection and self-doubt that the discipline experienced in the 1980s. So let's look a little bit at this age of commitment, the rise of feminism in 1970s anthropology. I've put here an image of a very influential book of the time from 1974, edited by Michelle Rosaldo. We'll see more about her in the next clip. And Louise Lamfair and a whole bunch of really, really important people, including Sherry Ortner, who we looked at, I think, last week, and a whole array of super important feminist anthropologists kind of all participate in this volume, just to give you a sense of this, also a kind of sense of the collectivity and excitement of feminist anthropology in the 1970s. So very, very broadly, the critical, combative, in many ways militant arguments that were made at that time on the part of feminist anthropologists, overwhelmingly female feminist anthropologists, was a critique of the overwhelmingly male-centric character of theoretical models in classical anthropology. So if you think, for example, of the question of order, which was so central to structural functionalism in anthropology, people like Radcliffe Brown, Maya Fortes, early Mary Douglas, Audrey Richards also, so it wasn't only men who adopted this male-centric set of questions, as feminist anthropologists would critically claim in the 70s. But this question of how social reproduction occurs, how these homeostatic wholes that we call social groups reproduce themselves through time and protect themselves from the threat of disorder, right, presented this very much as an affair of men. Even though kinship was so central, it's always the men's role in regulating the traffic in women, as a very famous feminist article from that period called it critically, which is highlighted in this classical modern anthropology, right? The very idea of culture and these public meanings that Clifford Geertz talks about in his Thick Description article emphasizes male-controlled public arenas. Remember the cockfight, for example, that is so iconic in the development of anthropological thinking with Clifford Geertz and cultural anthropology. That's a very male-centric, it's all about masculinity. Men identifying, and excuse the pun, it is Clifford Geertz, with literally their cocks in the cockfight, but also their masculinity, right? That's such a powerfully male-centric image. And this is the kind of stuff that these feminist anthropologists are really questioning. Where are all the women is a huge question. And even, you know, I was being trained in the late 1990s, and still then it was a question that colleagues would often ask, or my teachers would often ask critically, often of male presenters in a seminar, you know, where are all your women? Where are all the women in your account? You know, where is gender? You know, it took a great deal of work for these questions to come to the surface, and the work was primarily done by feminist anthropologists, or centrally done by feminist anthropologists. So the diagnosis of the problem that was given at the time was triple. First of all, the anthropologists themselves had a male bias, right? Secondly, the cultures often, or societies, that anthropologists were studying were themselves constituted in a patriarchal way, in which power was overwhelmingly in the hands of men. So if you recall, for example, in the Marxism lecture, I talked about Claude Meyassous's study in West Africa, a Marxist study of inequality and exploitation, and he talks about gender being a primary fault line of exploitation in those societies in that part of sub-Saharan Africa that he was looking at, and looking at the ways in which men controlled the productive powers of women, including the reproductive powers of women. We talked more recently about Sabah Mahmoud's argument, and we'll refer to it again later in this clip, about the ways in which heteronymous forms of freedom are practiced in a piety movement, in a particular kind of mosque movements in Cairo, where she did her research, and the patriarchal structures that underpin those practices. Again, so there's a male bias very often, not always, but very often in the societies themselves that are being studied by the anthropologists. And of course, as any feminist would remind you, and you don't need to be a feminist, I hope, to be aware of this, a massively male-oriented bias still today, and certainly in the 1970s, in the societies in which anthropologists predominantly were hosted or did their work, which is, what quote-unquote Western society or European American societies were themselves thoroughly phallocratic, patriarchal societies, right? So these three contexts explain the male bias in anthropological theory. So anthropology was a conduit for reproducing this male centricity as far as these feminist anthropologists were concerned. So there's a development, of course, to this argument. I've put here some more kind of titles of massively influential books by predominantly female anthropologists advancing these kinds of arguments. Anthropology of women by women becomes a kind of byword, no pun intended, of the time. So first of all, a focus on women, more and more studies being conducted looking at the role of women, the position of women, the contribution of women to social and cultural life. Looking at what women actually do, as opposed to what male informants or respondents or interlocutors and male ethnographers say that they do. So a very old Malinowskian actually distinction between, Malinowski makes this distinction in his introduction to the Argonauts of the Western Pacific, that iconic text of British social anthropology, between what people say they do and what they actually do, and how important it is for ethnographers who can actually see people through participant observation to get to that level of what people are actually doing as opposed to just what they say in an interview that they're doing. Well, this feminist current of anthropology deploys this Malinowskian insight in this particular way in order to put female respondents at the center of the narrative that anthropology develops about a particular social group. And this focus on women allows feminist anthropologists, and this is where things get really exciting from a theoretical point of view, to rework and recenter anthropological theory itself. So I mentioned earlier the male centricity of classical modern anthropology in the 20th century was bound up and central to some of the theoretical models, for example, the order model that kind of structural functionalism developed. This was absolutely open to question the moment that people, particularly feminist anthropologists, started looking not only at men, but also at women, however kind of obvious that may sound to you, right? So not just adding the female perspective to anthropology, but reimagining anthropology itself. What kinds of new questions can we ask when we start adopting these new perspectives and vantage points ethnographically and analytically as anthropologists? Okay, so the next step in this argument, so we have this focus on women and reshifting the ground of anthropological theory by refocusing in this way. But this leads, and not least through the influence of this massively important figure in gender theory, Judith Butler, whose image I've put up there. My face covers the cover of the, so the cover gets covered of her most famous book, or most relevant to the argument here, Gender Trouble, a highly recommended book, in which Judith Butler argues that, of course, the distinction between the sexes is to be distinguished between gendered differences, right? So biology is not the same, and biological distinctions between the sexes, male and female, are not in any way the same thing as the way in which gender is enacted and, for Judith Butler, performed and inculcated and learnt in any given social and cultural setting. So don't think that gender is natural. It's thoroughly cultural, social, historical, and therefore needs to be understood as a social construction and a social performance. So this argument, for which Judith Butler is extremely famous and has been so massively influential in feminist anthropology and more broadly the anthropology of gender, precipitates precisely a move of broadening out, not just putting women on the table, but actually putting the question of gender as a whole and the critical question and the critical study of gender on the table for anthropology. And of course, the whole development of gender studies is something that happens at that time. Really looking at the constitution and construction of gender roles. Of course, I mentioned in the first clip for this week how resonant these debates are in today's political and theoretical environment. Of course, what I've just said must be massively resonant for people of your generation, people of the current student generation, for whom questions of gender roles, gender performances, gender fluidity are of course so central in a way that they weren't for people of my generation, right? Now, these currents, Judith Butler and others, Henrietta Moore, an incredibly influential person in British anthropology specifically, but also gender theory more broadly. Actually a colleague here at UCL now, for many years at the LSE, then moved to Cambridge, now moved to UCL. Massively influential in developing these ideas. We'll see more figures in a moment. So this move to the study of gender is central to what we're talking about, and is really the kind of episode that followed that attempt by feminist anthropologists specifically to put the study of women on the table, right? So the idea that images, attributes, activities that are associated with women, and now let's use these categories in inverted commas because they're social, cultural categories rather than neutral, gendered categories. Neutral, natural categories. All of these attributes and images are culturally and historically specific, right? So biological differences do not provide a universal basis for social definition. So, of course, the idea of transgender that is so prominent in public debate today has its roots in this idea that biological definitions or differences do not provide a basis for social definitions of gender. So this leads to an act of denaturalization. Gender is denaturalized. Categories such as male, female, man, woman, boy, girl, etc. Need to be investigated, not taken for granted, right? And this crucially, ultimately leads to a shift in the feminist argument from a kind of focus on sameness to a focus on difference, if you like. So if early feminism laid great store, and there's kind of different waves of feminism, as many of you may know, right? First wave, second wave, third wave. These shifts, right? If early waves of feminism were focusing on the universal shared experiences of women, in trying to make these transparent and put them up for political attack and critique, so this idea of kind of a universal subordination of women, in many ways paralleling the kinds of arguments that a Marxist approaches would make about the universal subordination of the proletariat, right? A kind of analogous move, right? As gender, the critical study of gender gains ground in social theory and in anthropology as well, there's an increasing moving away from these questions of universality, uncomfortably sometimes, A very important article in this transition is Marilyn Strathern's absolutely mind-bogglingly sophisticated article called Feminism and Anthropology, an Awkward Relationship, where Strathern precisely is charting out, I think, this transition that we're talking about, from sameness and universality to an interest in difference and the differential ways in which gendered distinctions are constituted. And I said I was going to mention Saba Mahmood again, because we mentioned her last week, and we'll come back to her also in a couple of weeks again. She's such a great example of so many of the ideas that we're looking at. So we saw the uncomfortable way in which Saba Mahmood, herself of course a feminist, took to task certain Eurocentric versions of universalizing feminism that depicted the plight of Muslim women as one of straightforward oppression to a patriarchy, right? So, you know, in that sense, there's a kind of notion of universality, that the experience of oppression that women might experience or might have in a context in Cairo might be analogous or similar to the experience of, say, women being exploited in the shop floor in an industrial setting in, you know, in Wales, or for, I don't know, in Dagenham, where cars are being produced or were being produced, and, you know, somehow these are expressions of the same thing. And an anthropological argument such as Saba Mahmood's lays question in this kind of claim of universality, and really variegates and pluralizes possibilities for feminist critique in uncomfortable ways often, because there's a tendency towards relativity here. So kind of relativism introduced through the study of the critical study of gender in this context. Just to close this slide, I've put a whole bunch of important books here and a whole bunch of important figures. There's Henrietta Moore, I mentioned, A Passion for Difference, really famous book. Marilyn Strathern, I mentioned. You know, a whole bunch of people. Saba Mahmood is there. So have a look. Whom am I covering? I can't. Oh, this is Lila Abu Lugod. Fantastic. Also kind of in some ways aligned feminist, kind of anthropological feminist critique that is in many ways parallel to the kinds of critiques of Saba Mahmood by Lila Abu Lugod. The title of her book says it all: Do Muslim Women Need Saving? Very saving from whom, you may ask, and by whom? So these are the kinds of questions. They're all up there for you to look at. There's so many more books that you can read, but those are some kind of real classic ones that show the variety of approaches. So I'll leave it there for this week, not for this week, sorry, for this clip, and see you in the next one.